This video is a continuation of the list notebook and will describe Python list indexing. So in the previous section, we discussed how to manually create lists. And now I want to show you how we can index those lists, meaning how we can access their individual elements. So first, let's recall our list of squares we used in the previous section. If we wanted to access the first element of the squares list, we would write the list name, squares, followed by square brackets containing an integer, 0 in this case. In Python, all indices begin at 0, so the first element of the list has index 0. And of course, when we run this, we see that we get element 1 returned to us. If we wanted to access the second element of the list, we would actually use index 1. And the last element of the list would be indexed by the length of the list minus 1, or 4 in this case, since we have 5 elements. Now, I should point out here that for those of you that watched the video on strings, may recall that indexing a string returns another string. Lists, on the other hand, do not return lists when indexed. Instead, they return whatever data type was stored in the requested index. So for all these examples here, since we have a list of integers, all the outputs of our indexing are integers. Now, if we attempt to use an index that is beyond the length of the list, the interpreter is going to raise an index error exception and state that the list index is out of range. And it's because of this that we really need to take care that we only use valid indices when indexing. So how do we determine which indices are valid? Well, one way is to use the length function, or len. The length function returns the number of items in an object. So when I say len and pass squares as the argument, it will return to us 5 because we have 5 elements in our list. This function allows us to determine the valid range of indices for a given list and can help us to prevent receiving the index error exception that we saw above. Now, up until this point, we've been using positive integers to index our list, but Python also supports negative indices. Positive indices start with 0, referring to the first element in the list, and go up to the length minus 1, referring to the last element in the list. Negative indices go in the opposite direction. They start with negative 1, referring to the last element in the list, and go until minus the length of the list, referring to the first element of the list. And similarly, if we attempt to use a negative index that is out of range, you see that we get the same index error exception that we got with positive indices.